Was anything in my email correct?
I've actually got a draft going for you, so I'll send it to you a little bit later.
All right. Thanks, Rabbi.
But yeah, you basically had the gist of it, which is it's complicated and it depends.
Can't complain.
Was anything in my email correct?
Yep.
Wow. A backlog.
And
Oh, you have the YouTube on.
yeah, I'm trying to broadcast it, so now I just needed to pop out the chat and put that over there. And then I can minimize that. And I can pop out the chat from here, just in case.
Hey, Rabbi.
Now we're good. Okay, I think I got all the technology coordinated. Yes.
Was that also one of the reasons why it's important to make sure you're on your, you keep the commandments more in the synagogue? Was because they might affect other people too?
You mean in terms of like, as you keep a commandment, it's more visible to other people and they might get the wrong interpretation?
Well, no, it was and the fact that it influences other people, how you act.
Right, yes, exactly. That's what I mean by get the wrong interpretation, yes.
All right.
Now, we should always act as though what we're doing is going to be used as a example for others. As frightening as that can be, but when you have children, you realize that does happen all the time. They are constantly watching you and seeing what you're doing. It's like when people wonder where their children learn to swear or where they learn to be petty. Usually it's because they've watched their parents.
Yes, absolutely right. I had that experience in our own synagogue last Saturday when somebody didn't want to, that will not be mentioned, anyways.
I mean, it's not always. I've definitely met kids who were not following in their parents' footsteps for one reason or another, either doing better than their parents or worse. But certainly that is a major influence on how people behave.
And by the way, your son is getting so tall. My goodness.
It is absolutely terrifying. He's hitting that age where growth really starts taking off.
Yes, he looks so handsome. He's such a good boy. He really is.
Well, I like him. All right, just making sure everyone else knows about it. I think I sent it to WhatsApp, so give it just another few seconds here, and then we're going to go ahead and start rolling. I know people might be getting back into the swing of it since we had last week off during the intermediate days of the festival. Well, not festival technically, but between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, the Aseret Yemei Teshuvah. We're coming up on Chol HaMoed next week, but it's not quite as, there's not quite as so much turmoil. So I think we'll still be able to continue next week as usual. All right, so let's go ahead and get going. Anyone who comes late can always watch the video relog. We are beginning a new Masechet, a new section of the Mishnah. And just for fun, I thought I would pick something a little different than what we've done, which has a very wide selection of topics. And that is Mishnah Sotah. Now, you'll notice that we're not looking at the Mishnah to start. That is because even more than other sections of the Mishnah, knowing the relevant section of the Torah is going to become very, very important for unpacking how the Mishnah handles it. And also, unlike many other sections of the Mishnah, which draw from texts that are scattered throughout the entire Torah, the text for Mishnah Sotah is pretty much all in one chapter. This is the book of Numbers, Bamidbar, chapter 5. Verse 11 is where we're going to be started if you want to use your own copy. As we're going to quickly see, the topic is one that will probably make some people uncomfortable. And the surface reading, and by surface reading, I do not mean Peshat. The surface reading is also likely to make people uncomfortable or at the very least confused. Now, what do I mean by the difference between surface reading and Peshat? Those of you who have studied before will know that Peshat usually means the plain meaning of the text. However, there is often a misunderstanding of people who think the plain meaning of the text means that it is their reading of the text. That is not how this works. This is not the early days of Martin Luther believing that every man is their own priest and therefore every interpretation is equal if guided by a pious soul. That's not how Judaism does this. Judaism says, no, you need more than a pious soul. You need to have the instruction of our tradition as well as the companionship and debate of other colleagues. And that is what leads you to the Peshat. A simple understanding is that by people who think that their own surface reading, the surface understanding is that for people who think their own reading is good enough without any commentary or assistance. And the surface reading is what gets you into real trouble in chapter 5 here. So we're going to go through, I'm going to talk about a little bit of the surface reading. I'll talk a little bit about the Peshat, but I want to make sure that we have the basic structure outlined before we see how the Mishnah handles it and how it completely changes and makes a mockery of that surface reading and instead gives us a much simpler, clearer, and far better reading for this chapter. All right, so that's the introduction. Let's get down to work. The Lord spoke to Moses saying, "Speak to the Israelite people and say to them, if any man's wife has gone astray and broken faith with him." All right, so surface reader, that is to say a person who is not being very careful in their reading and has no benefit of tradition or of teachers, would say, chapter 5, here we go. We're talking about women that are doing wrong things. However, women doing wrong things, says Peshat, says the simple meaning of the text, is handled elsewhere, meaning that if a woman or a man commits adultery, actually doing wrong things, we have our own way of handling that. And we do not need this section of chapter 5. So the simple meaning, the Peshat meaning, is telling me that something is going on here other than just cut and dry plain adultery. Because if that was what was happening, we would not need any of the rest of this chapter. So what is actually going on here when we say that she has gone astray and that she has broken faith? Well, verse 13, in that a man has had carnal relations with her unbeknown to her husband, and she keeps secret the fact that she has defiled herself without being forced, and there is no witness against her. All right, so some very interesting caveats here. The simple reader, again, not the correct reading, but a simple reading would say, yes, that's right. She's having adultery, but it's secret, and there was no one witnessed against her. That must be what we're dealing with here. The problem, of course, is if there are no witnesses, then it cannot be established that she has actually committed adultery. So that must mean we are dealing with some other form of something that's happening here that would allow her to be in trouble in this unique set of circumstances. Of course, we also get the reminders, which are very clear, that if a woman is forced to have sex, even while she is married, that is not the same as committing adultery. And of course, she would be blameless in a case where she had been raped while married. So that is a very important caveat that is being put in here. It is also very important to note that it is reminding us that you need a witness to establish anything in Jewish law. But a careful reader would also notice that in general, Jewish law requires 2 witnesses. And yet here, the text is talking only about a single witness. Again, a rather unusual deviation from what we would have expected. We'll obviously go into that in much more detail once we reach the Mishnah. 14. But a fit of jealousy comes over him, right? Ruach kin'ah, this spirit of jealousy comes over him, and he is wrought up, or literally kineh, but he is jealous about the wife who has defiled herself. Or if a fit of jealousy comes over one and he is wrought up about his wife, although she has not defiled herself. All right, so first of all, you may remember if you saw a sermon I gave a little while ago that this phrase kin'eh or kin'ah, used in the different forms in the sentence, is usually translated as jealousy, is different than you might have thought by modern English usage. Jealousy in the classical Hebrew meaning is to be zealously passionate about guarding something, to prevent a betrayal. And in this particular case, it seems to be that he has come to the conclusion, without evidence, that his wife has betrayed him. And as you can see, this verse is outlining that there are two possible outcomes. Either he has come to that conclusion and he's wrong, or he has come to that conclusion and he's right. But in both cases, he came to that conclusion without any evidence. Right? This is a moment of passion. This is a moment of paranoia, you might say, especially if she's innocent. And that is what is moving him to be agitated and for the rest of the procedure to unfold. Verse 15, let me just scroll down. The man shall bring his wife to the priest, to the Kohen. In the ancient world, this would have been the tabernacle, the Mishkan, and then later the temple. And he shall bring as an offering for her 1/10 of an ephah of barley flour. No oil shall be poured upon it, no frankincense shall be laid on it, for it is a meal offering of jealousy, a meal offering of remembrance, which recalls wrongdoing. So he brings her there. A sacrifice is being made of this grain. We'll talk much more about this in the Mishnah. And it's definitely different than a regular sacrifice. And this then is going to be laid out as part of the ceremony. Sorry, just double checking. I thought someone was asking they had trouble getting in, but nope. Okay. Ceremony continues now. Verse 16. The priest shall bring her forward and have her stand before the Lord. The priest shall take sacral water, that is to say, holy water. Again, like I was mentioning in my Yom Kippur sermon, one of those words that just sounds weird in Judaism, but is perfectly native. Will bring this holy water in an earthen vessel, and taking some of the earth that is on the floor of the tabernacle, the priest shall put it into the water. Now, again, I should point out that even though holy water in English sounds like that which is used in other religions, this is not the same thing. But what is certainly striking for us here is that the priest, in addition to having her stand there in front, is also taking this water and pouring dirt into it, taken from the floor of the tabernacle. After he has made the woman stand before the Lord, the priest shall bear the woman's head and place upon her hands the meal offering of remembrance, the sacrificial parts that were brought by her husband, which is the meal offering of jealousy. And in the priest's hands shall be the water of bitterness that induces the spell. Spell is entirely the wrong word. Really, the better word here is curse. And curse is not like a witch's curse. Curse means the concept that will be of a negative consequence for her if she has committed this trespass. Now, as we're going to see in verse 19, it may seem from a simple reading, a surface reading, that all of this assumes the woman is guilty. But that is something that you should really not believe, because if we knew she was guilty, none of this would be happening. The priest shall adjure the woman. I love that word adjure, because it is a word that only comes up in translations of the Torah, and most people have no idea what it means in English. Adjure literally means cause or force someone else to swear an oath. So just like you would swear someone in before they give testimony in an American court, so too she is being sworn at this time as well. She is being asked to make an oath, saying to her, if no man has lain with you, if you have not gone astray in defilement while married to your husband, be immune from the harm, from this bitterness that induces the spell, induces the curse. But if you have gone astray while married to your husband and have defiled yourself, if a man other than your husband has had carnal relations with you, continuing in verse 21, here verse 21 continues with the rest of this with a little instructions. Here the priest shall administer the curse of adjuration to the woman, as the priest goes on to say to the woman, may the Lord make you a curse and an imprecation among your people, meaning people will use your name as being, you don't want to be like Mrs. So-and-so. As the Lord causes your thigh to sag and your belly to distend, may this water that induces the spell, the curse, to enter your body, cause the belly to distend and the thigh to sag, and the woman shall say, Amen, Amen. All right, Aaron, question.
Yes. Does the when it says marriage, does that include the betrothal?
Yes, more or less, yes. Judaism generally considers that once a betrothal has taken place, if there is an act of adultery, that is considered to be as adultery, as adulterous, as if the final act of marriage had also taken place. Okay, verse 23. The priest shall put these curses down in writing and rub it off into the water of bitterness. So he literally writes out all of that onto a scroll, and then that scroll is rubbed, is erased into the water. So you now have the water with dirt plus the rubbing off of the writing on the scroll. He is to make the woman drink the water of bitterness that induces the spell, curse. I really hate that they use the word spell here, so that the curse-inducing water may enter into her to bring on bitterness. Right? This is a bit of a play on words that doesn't work in English, right? That she is taking this bitter waters, right? Hamarim, ha'me'ararim, right? You can hear the marim and me'ararim, the bitterness and cursiness are linked together for the what do they call it? The assonance in the English. And this is what she is going to drink. Then the priest shall take from the woman's hand the meal offering of jealousy, elevate the meal offering before the Lord, and present it on the altar. He shall scoop out of the meal offering a token part of it and turn it into smoke on the altar. Last, he shall make the woman drink the water. Once he has made her drink the water, if she has defiled herself by breaking faith with her husband, the spell-inducing water shall enter into her to bring on bitterness, so that her belly shall distend and her thighs shall sag, and the woman shall become a curse among her people. Again, this is in a surface reading sounding like some magic voodoo system that is going to expose her crime through this magic water, because everything was hidden up to this point. As we'll see from the Mishnah, that is not the correct reading. Verse 28, brings us up to, but if the woman has not defiled herself and is pure, she has not had any adultery, she shall be unharmed and able to retain seed. That is to say that she'll be able to get pregnant. This is the ritual in the case of jealousy when a woman goes astray while married to her husband and defiles herself, or when a fit of jealousy comes over a man and he is wrought up over his wife. The woman shall be made to stand before the Lord, and the priest shall carry out all this ritual with her. The man shall be clear of guilt, but that woman shall suffer for her guilt. And that last verse should sound incredibly confusing. And that's one of the things the Mishnah will bring us back to. So I'm not going to try and go into it right now. Okay. Hopefully you found that a little confusing. Hopefully you found that on the surface reading very odd and archaic and almost like a witch trial. And all of that is completely not true. This is not meant to be handled like a witch trial. This is not putting all the power in the hands of the husband. This is not subjugating the woman to some terrible ordeal that is entirely being against her as a completely innocent person. And if that's the way you read it, well, then that's why we need to have our tradition clarify things for us so that we don't misread things that we might think we have the grasp of, but in fact need a little bit more work. So let's do some of that work. Where'd my mouse go? There we go. Mishnah Sotah, chapter 1, Mishnah 1. Okay, so throughout, I'm going to try and remember to make references to the Hebrew as needed, because there are some issues with the translation if you don't know what it's referring to. That will make things even more confusing than they are. And the first thing that we have to deal with is the very first word, hamikaneh. So hamikaneh is the one who is jealous for his wife. However, the Mishnah is using this in a technical term. They are not using it as just being a guy who is jealous. They are using it to mean a person who is jealous to the point that they have warned their wife Now, what that warning is going to be in Mishnah 2. So just hold on for a second and we'll get back to what that warning is. But understand that when it says warning, it is talking about that first stage of a feeling of jealousy. It is not talking about the actual adultery. It is talking about him being jealous before adultery has been committed. One who warns his wife, implication here, as we'll see, is meaning to not associate with a certain man. Rabbi Eliezer says he warns her on the testimony of 2 witnesses and makes her drink the bitter waters on the testimony of 1 witness or on his own testimony. Rabbi Joshua says he warns her on the testimony of 2 and makes her drink on the testimony of 2. I'm going to go ahead and put in the second Mishnah as well, because I think it will help us understand that a bit more clearly.
Who won that argument?
Well, like I said, let me go ahead and do the second Mishnah as well, or else it's going to be rather unclear. How does he warn her? Right? He warns her in front of 2 witnesses. Do not speak with that man, right? With Mr. So-and-so. And she spoke with him. Oh, hold on. Someone else coming in through the waiting room. And she spoke with him. She is still permitted to her husband and permitted to eat truma. Now, what's going on here? So if a woman is considered to be in this category of being suspected with this warning in place, and I'm going to go back and unpack all that in just a second, but if she is actually guilty of breaking the warning, then she would no longer be permitted sexually with her husband until the Sotah ritual had taken place, and she would not be allowed to eat truma if her husband happened to be a Kohen. Truma was the food that was given as special gifts to the Kohanim, and the Kohanim and their family, meaning their wives as well, would be allowed to eat from it, but they all had to be sure that they were ritually pure. If she had become ritually impure through adultery, then she would not be allowed to eat it. And the middle ground here is that if she has been kind of caught, we're going to unpack that in a second, then she would not be allowed. She would not be allowed to have that truma, and she would not be allowed to be intimate with her husband, and vice versa. He would not be allowed to be intimate with her either. So if all the husband said was, do not talk with Mr. So-and-so, and she went and talked with Mr. So-and-so, she has not tripped the wire to engage the second part of our whole issue. She has not gone to the next level of the issue. Yes, she disobeyed her husband, but disobeying her husband and even talking to her husband with a man that he does not want her talking with is not enough to put her under this issue of Sotah. Now, you may be thinking, but wait a minute, Rabbi. When we read through chapter 5, it just talked about jealousy. What's with all of this warning? What's with this witnesses of don't talk to so-and-so? What's going on here? Right? So this is where our tradition, as I mentioned, clarifies things for us in a way that makes the chapter 5 much more understandable. But the jealousy isn't what took him to the temple. The jealousy is what made him warn his wife. And only after she violates that in a very particular way, as we'll see, do we then continue with the rest of chapter 5's ritual and the trip to the temple. But this is explaining here that there are 2 stages. There is a warning stage, and then there is a violation of the warning stage. And just talking is not a sufficient violation of the warning stage. In fact, it's only if she entered a private place with him and stayed with him for a time sufficient for her to be defiled, meaning long enough to have sex, she is then forbidden to her husband and forbidden to eat truma. Right? So now she has tripped the wire on that first level of having violated the warning that he gave her. Right? Even if the warning was don't talk, she is not considered to be in trouble for Sotah, for going up to Jerusalem and doing the ritual, unless she is actually secluded. And even then, it's only if she is secluded long enough for her to be able to have actually had sex. right? If they walk behind a door for 15 seconds, we do not consider that long enough that she has actually been compromised by the act.
And still the husband needs 2 witnesses.
All right, so that's something that we're going to have to unpack in just a second. But just give me a second to finish this Mishnah. All right, if her husband died, meaning after she had tripped this wire, after she had been secluded, and after he had warned her, she performs chalitza, but she cannot contract yibum. She cannot get married to her brother-in-law. Remember, the usual pattern is that when a husband dies, leaving no children, the widow is supposed to marry her brother-in-law in order that they can have a child, which will be considered to be the child of the deceased. But if the warning and the violation of the warning through the seclusion in long enough time has happened, and before the Sotah ritual can take place in Jerusalem, the husband dies before that can happen, then she is split from the brother-in-law, and she may not marry him because there was never a resolution to this doubt hanging over her from the first husband. Aaron, question.
How come they don't resolve the resolution with Sotah? Because that seems like it punishes. Well, I shouldn't say punish, but that seems like the guy who died, then his lineage is cut off, and that's the whole purpose of the Levirate marriage, was so that his lineage isn't cut off, right?
Well, yes, but the issue here is that as we'll see, there's no way to resolve the issue of her suspected adultery without the husband. So once he passes, the ritual can no longer be performed. So therefore, she would always have this cloud over her, and forcing her brother-in-law to marry her, or even giving him the option to marry her, would be tantamount to having him marry an adulteress. And so they said, therefore, do chalitza, since that is a perfectly acceptable option, and not do the yibum, not do the Levirate marriage.
How come the brother couldn't stand in for Sotah?
Well, so the rabbis are reading the text very, very carefully. And as you saw, it is the husband that brings the sacrifice. And so without him, the ritual cannot take place. And that's going to become very important in a lot more detail as we go forward.
He can't act as an agent, huh, to a dead person?
Not in this particular way. Obviously, in the fulfillment of a will or other types of issues, yes, but not in this particular form. One of the general patterns we're going to see throughout Mishnah Sotah is that the way the rabbis believe our tradition leads us to understand chapter 5 is to extremely limit how all of this takes place. That is to say, this was not done as a fit of jealousy. We'll back up to Mishnah 1 so I can explain that in more detail, right? It looked like when we had our surface reading of chapter 5, that the husband could just wake up one day and say, I don't like what you're doing. I think you've been fooling around on me, and drag her off to Jerusalem. Or that the husband could say, I saw you go in that back room with Mr. So-and-so. I don't like you and him talking. Let's go to Jerusalem. But what the rabbis are telling us is that's not the order of the events. That's not how Sotah works. There needs to be a warning. The warning is specific to her, specific for the man, and specifically about seclusion. If he doesn't meet those criterias, and there was no witnessing to that criteria, then even if she goes off and she's alone with Mr. So-and-so, if there is no proof that she is actually defiled, then nothing can happen. He cannot drag her to Jerusalem just on his own suspicions, and he cannot drag her to Jerusalem even if she went against his commands, but those commands were not witnessed, or even if she did something he didn't like and he hadn't warned her about it in the first place. They are fencing in this entire system into a very rigid process that takes the passion and jealousy right away from everything. And in fact, I'll just give a little bit of a forewarning. The rabbis did not like this process. They did not believe this was a worthwhile activity for a man to be pursuing. they did not think this was the right way for a husband to behave. Obviously, they don't like adultery and all that too, but they were focused very much on trying to dissuade husbands from engaging in this process altogether. So that will be a theme that will run throughout how they read chapter 5. Natan, were you asking a question?
And about the chalitza, that you say that the brother cannot make the chalitza, but what happened if the person that the husband was concerned was the same brother? So if it was the same brother that he think that he had something with the wife and he died, that brother will not have any problem doing chalitza because anyway they were lovers.
It's always like a telenovela. You always have such a good imagination, right? So yes, the Talmud begins asking questions about, well, what happens if he forbids her from being with people that she normally would be with, like a relative? And yes, that it's not surprising to find that 2,000 years ago, the rabbis also knew plenty of people that had these types of issues, both that had spouses that would sometimes betray them with other relatives, and also that there were spouses who were so jealous that they would try to keep their wife from being with other relatives. Yes, that was a major issue.
There are no problem to do the chalitza because there's no problem for the husband, the brother to marry her because he know that they had a relationship. So he had no problem because he know that the person that she had the relationship was him. So it's not like he's concerned and maybe she will not be very
Faithful
loyal to him.
Right, but that's exactly the problem, right? That the issue is that if she really was having adultery with the brother, then she would be forbidden to be with him, right? If there is enough grounds for considering adultery, but not enough for an actual execution, remembering that adultery, when properly witnessed and warned and prosecuted, can lead to the death penalty. But if there is enough grounds for adultery to cause a separation and for her to lose her ketubah, to no longer be given the money that was owed to her from a divorce, she is not allowed to be with her husband, and she is not allowed to be with the man whom she was committing adultery with. She is forbidden to both of them.
Including after the death of the husband?
After the death, after the divorce, they are permanently prohibited from being with each other.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Because I thought that the provision is connected with the husband. Now, if the
do
husband pass away, she's free.
No, you do not get to marry your lover. Right?
Oh.
If you commit adultery and it is discovered, you do not get to marry them. Obviously, then if it's not discovered, you still should not be marrying that person. It's just the community doesn't know it enough to stop it.
Wow. Yeah, party poopers.
Yeah, I know. Adultery was kind of treated as a big deal back then. Yes.
If they figure out, if they discover the adultery after you got married, that annuls the marriage, right?
It would depend. Generally speaking, they don't accept testimony after certain points. So it would be more of a question of if they discovered that she was not eligible to have been married to him because there was incontrovertible evidence that is brought after the fact that she wasn't eligible at the time, then yes, the same way that if you marry someone and later discover that they're your sister, that the marriage is no longer valid. But it's a fairly rare type of circumstance. Okay, so let's get down to our witnessing here. Where's my mouse? Come on. All right, so the issue here between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Joshua, is how much evidence do you need in order to do this? Now, as you can see, Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Joshua both agree that if she is being warned, that has to be done in front of two witnesses, right? When the husband says, don't go near Mr. A, he has to be saying that in front of two witnesses. That is absolutely agreed. The difference, the place where they argue, is about what happens if she does go with Mr. A into this secluded area. Rabbi Eliezer holds that he can make her drink, which is the technical term that they use in the Mishnah for going to Jerusalem for the ceremony, that can be done even if only one person witnessed her being alone, or even if he himself is the witness. Now, his justification for this, according to the Talmud, is one of my favorite phrases, that it's yesh raglayim ladavar, that there are legs to the matter, right? So what does that mean? It's almost the same idiom in English, right? That there are sufficient grounds to accept this impinged testimony, this limited witnessing, because he already warned her, right? So we already had grounds to be suspicious, and therefore moving on to the next stage does not require the same level of testimony. Rabbi Joshua, on the other hand, says, no, you need to have two witnesses before, you need to have two witnesses for the warning, you need to have two witnesses for the seclusion. Again, every time we see, let me show you here, the makes her drink phrase, you have to understand that mashka is talking about taking her to Jerusalem for the rest of the ritual. And ultimately, Rabbi Joshua wins this argument, but they both agree in a piece of Talmudic understanding that neither one of them is talking about actually witnessing the defilement, meaning sex, that they both agree that if there was a single witness or even the husband himself, but not enough to convict of adultery, but enough to say, you know what, he warned her, she was secluded, and somebody actually saw them having sex, then we don't go to Jerusalem, but they do get divorced. And she does not receive her ketubah money, right? So again, this is another way that the rabbis derail the ritual. If there was a warning and there was a seclusion, but one person saw not just the seclusion, but the actual act of sexual intimacy, then we don't do the rest of this ritual. No waters, no scroll, no sacrifice, nothing else that happens. Do not pass go directly to divorce, and you do not get your ketubah because you were committing adultery. All right, so questions on that, or shall we move to Mishnah 3?
Hey, Rabbi.
Yes.
It'll be a divorce almost every time, because after adultery, even if he doesn't want to divorce her, she's still forbidden to him, right?
Oh, if it's actually adultery, but not enough to be convicted for the death penalty, then it is divorced whether he likes it or not.
Oh.
The community will not allow them to remain together. Now, that's something that's a little bit more complicated in the modern world, and I don't want to get into it right now. But biblically, yes, if there was an incontrovertible, public known case of adultery that didn't meet the death penalty criteria, the community basically forced them to divorce.
So she's only forbidden to her husband if he first raped her? Because they couldn't divorce if there was a rape, right?
Oh! You mean in the case of a man who raped the woman and then had to marry her at the end? But
right.
rape, right? But you're talking about a completely different case. I just want to make sure everyone listening knows that you just moved the topic, right? So yes, if a man comes across a woman that is not married and rapes her, then one of the punishments that can be imposed, in addition to other monetary fines and other forms of punishment, is that he would have to marry her if he and if her family and she wanted that. She wasn't obligated to marry him, but he would be obligated to marry her should that be her and her family's decision. And in such a case, yes, he is not allowed to divorce her ever.
And if she commits adultery, then she's just forbidden to her husband?
I don't remember that particular wrinkle of what happens if the woman that he raped and was then married to commits adultery. It's not something that's come up in my studies. Generally speaking, the rabbis frowned on marrying them off and generally made him just pay the fines and go. So it wasn't something that came up routinely throughout our history. All right. Mishnah 3. The following are prohibited to eat truma. Now remember, prohibiting to eat truma is a shorthand technical term. They're not only talking about the wife of a Kohen who is now no longer able to eat from the truma because of intercourse. This is basically saying these women are now no longer on the Sotah pipeline. They're no longer headed to Jerusalem. They are no longer going to be permitted to their husband. They are getting a divorce. They are not going to drink the waters, right? So it's a technical term, but it means more than it says it means. So all of the following categories of women are now removed from potentially drinking the waters in Jerusalem. So who gets removed? She who says to her husband, I am unclean to you. And witnesses came and testified that she was unclean, right? So if she says, I did it, right? And there are witnesses that says, yeah, she did it, then we don't do the Sotah ritual. Remember, the Sotah ritual was there to remove doubt. It was not there when there was certainty. So she would know if she had sex or not, and therefore she is out of the pipeline for going to Jerusalem. Additionally, she who says, I refuse to drink, right? She will not do the Sotah ritual. If she wants out of this process, if she does not want to go to Jerusalem and she does not want to drink the water, she doesn't have to admit that she did anything wrong. All she has to do is say, I don't want to drink. And in which case she is divorced, she does not receive her get, but nothing else happens to her. Right? So it's basically like in the modern legal sense, it'd be like pleading no contest. Right? She's not admitting guilt. She's not claiming innocence. She just does not want to go through with the trial. Additionally, she whose husband does not want her to make her drink. Right? So if the husband says, you know what, I don't want to do this process. I know that I warned her in front of witnesses, and I know she was secluded in front of witnesses, but I don't want to go through with this. Then she doesn't go through with it, meaning he does not take her to Jerusalem. He is not obligated to carry on with the ritual if he has decided that he does not want to do this.
So
Now,
in this case, he needs to pay the ktuba.
In this case, there wouldn't even necessarily be, yes, there wouldn't necessarily need to be anything else that was done. Because basically what he has decided is that he is not willing to follow through on the threat. And that's really the way the rabbis felt about this whole warning process, that this jealousy was a very bad emotion on the husband's part, that he had made a mistake. They even say it was like a spirit of stupidity that made him do this in the first place, that you should never put yourself and your spouse in this position. And if he had second thoughts at the last minute, then yes, he would no longer need to proceed. And similarly, she whose husband had intercourse with her on the journey, right? So he gets the warning, she violates the warning and is secluded in front of witnesses. They start on their way to Jerusalem, and while they're traveling, he has sex with her, right? This woman that he suspects of adultery enough that he has warned her and dragging her to Jerusalem, he still has sex with her, oh, one more fling, one more time, just for old time's sake, I can't resist her, whatever. Once that happens, he is not allowed to go further with the ritual, right? He has already discredited himself. He has already created a problem for the ritual, and therefore it's done. It's over. They're separated, and that's it.
So meaning the last two examples, they need to divorce or they keep a marriage?
No, they're divorced.
In the last both situations, they divorce. Doesn't matter if they don't want to divorce, they divorce. And he need to pay her the full ktuba.
So that's where the wonderful phrase, that she can't eat truma is trying to tell us. That, if her husband was a Kohen, she can no longer eat from his table. Right? They are separate.
But she received full ktuba.
So that gets a little bit more complicated, because she did still do something wrong. right? And that's something that I want to make sure we get really on the table right here at the beginning, because in a minute, it's going to get very degrading for the woman in Jerusalem. But we have to understand that she did do something wrong at this point, right? So whatever caused her husband's suspicion in the first place, which, as I've said, the Talmud is very clear that a man should not behave in this suspicious way towards his wife, but whatever she did that got his suspicion, that's one issue, but that's not a major issue. More importantly, however, for the sake of the peace of the household, he told her not to be alone with a particular person. And she chose not just to talk to the guy, but to actually be in a private, secluded place where nobody could witness what they were doing, and to be there long enough with the person, the precise person that the husband had been warning her about, who was willing to warn her about in front of witnesses. That's, you can imagine how embarrassing he must have felt about doing that in the first place. And she went ahead and did that. So whether or not she is an actual adulteress remains to be seen. That's what the ritual is trying to establish for us going further on. But she has done a lot to really put herself in a bad position at this place, right? All she had to do was not be alone with the guy. And all she had to do was get her husband to rescind his warning and make his fit of jealousy pass, right? So she's not exactly an adulteress, clearly, because if she was, none of this would be happening. And she's not exactly blameless, because if she was, none of this would be happening. You can't exactly say who's more responsible for what's going on, because we don't know exactly what she did at this stage in the ritual. But the way the rabbis have interpreted chapter 5, this is not just the husband woke up on the wrong side of the bed. This is only after he was willing to embarrass himself, embarrass his wife, bring strife between himself and his wife, bring strife between, according to the Talmud, his wife and other people, because she is now separating herself from other people because of all of this warning that her husband is giving her. And throughout all of that, he was willing to do it, and yet she was also willing to still be alone with this guy. So this is not a happy marriage. This is, I think, what we would call the definition of dysfunctional. And the dysfunction is definitely happening in different portions, in different ways, in both parts. And that's really important to hold on to as we go forward. Aaron, you had a question?
Yes, Rabbi. You said in all the cases they're divorced, even if the husband didn't want to divorce her.
Yes.
What happens if he doesn't want to give her the get?
The court forces him to. The rabbinic court used to have more muscle, right? The rabbinic court used to be able to persuade every husband to give a divorce, to give a get to his wife, up to and including physical coercion. So that was not left up to him to decide whether or not to give a get. I should also point out in the Talmud, they discuss, well, nowadays that we don't have the temple, what happens if a husband warns his wife and then she goes and she is witnessed being alone with the guy that he warned her about? And the answer is they get divorced. When this is why the Talmud says anybody who tries to do this ritual now is an imbecile, is an idiot, and is not a good person. Right? You are deliberately painting yourself into a corner where there is no good exit. So if you think this is licensed to be jealous or to be abusive or to be paranoid of your spouse, that is not what this section is trying to tell us. It is trying to tell us this is not a good way to bring shalom bayit to your house. This is not a good way to bring peace to your house.
Hey, Rabbi. Actually, this question never got answered. And these situations where where the wife forfeits her ketubah, does she still keep her dowry?
So the dowry, in the sense that the money that was set aside for her and that is owned by her throughout her marriage, remains her property. That is not something that was contingent upon her marriage. If you mean the money that was promised in the ketubah, that is forfeited. That's different. but property that is hers remains hers. All right, so how does the husband deal with her? Meaning, how is this supposed to work? He brings her to the court in the place where he resides, and they assign to him 2 disciples of the sages, lest he have intercourse with her on the journey. Rabbi Yehuda says her husband is trusted with her. All right, so the idea here is that you've got a case. You've warned her in front of witnesses. Witnesses have come that said that she was secluded. What do? You take her to your local court, right? You take her to the local Beit Din. The local Beit Din says, yes, we can hear that you did have testimony from these witnesses about the warning. We have testimony about the seclusion. Here are 2 assistants, right? 2 Talmidei Chachamim, right? 2 disciples of the sages, literally. And they will escort you to Jerusalem to try and make sure there is no hanky-panky. Now, Rabbi Yehuda says he's trusted, meaning we don't think he's going to be doing any hanky-panky on the way to Jerusalem. He's probably angry. Don't worry about it. Now, why would the court have these additional assistants going along with them to prevent this? If he does, he does. If he doesn't, he doesn't, right? Well, what do we care? Well, we care because if he violates any of this, then the waters won't test her correctly. It's something that the Talmud and the Mishnah is going to make clear later on, but it's important to get it out here now before people think this is totally barbaric, is if the husband has done something to invalidate the ritual on his side, then the ritual will have no effect on her, even if she is an actual adulteress. And so the rabbis were very worried that if he goes ahead and sleeps with her, and she goes to Jerusalem and she drinks the water and she turns around and says, ha ha, I got away with it, I really was an adulteress, that everyone is going to think that the ritual is a fake, that the ritual has no power, and thus God has no power. So the rabbis are very worried about the reputation of this ritual as a means of establishing the credible understanding of the woman's status. And that's going to come back in later on sections. All right, let's see. I think we got time for Mishnah 4. Okay. They bring her to the great court in Jerusalem, what we would call the Sanhedrin. And the judges solemnly admonish her, right? They talk to her about all of this in the same way that they admonish witnesses in capital cases. I think when we went through Sanhedrin, those of you who have been studying with me that long, you may remember that if you have a witness, not a suspect, a witness in the capital case, that they would run them up and down the stairs of the Sanhedrin, and they would get them tired and confused to see if their testimony was fragile, if their testimony broke. We don't treat witnesses like that in America, but in this case, they would do everything they could to make sure that the witnesses were giving honest and truthful and reliable testimony. And they do that for her as well. They make sure that she is not as strong and resilient as she might otherwise be, so that while they talk to her, if she breaks down, and as we'll see, confesses, then no one has to go through with the rest of the ritual. Right? They say to her, my daughter, now BT, my daughter, they are speaking to her in a considerate and a almost tender fashion. Much is done by wine, right? Meaning, if you drink a lot of wine, you can end up doing stuff you shouldn't be doing. So they're saying, maybe you got drunk, right? We understand you got drunk and you went alone with Mr. So-and-so, right? Much is done by frivolity, right? Sometimes people, they get silly. They get carried away. They end up doing stuff that they later regret, right? This is, of course, something that happens, unfortunately, all the time. Much is done by youth, right? You're young, you're stupid. Your passions got the better of you because you're not old enough to have learned how to control them and not respond to them like that. Much is done by bad neighbors, right? Maybe this guy was a neighbor, or maybe other neighbors were bad around you and they've influenced you. They've told you that, oh, it's fine. Everybody commits adultery. It's no big deal. It's okay. Maybe you've been misled. For the sake of his great name, which is written in holiness, do it so that it may not be rubbed out in the water. Right, so you may remember from chapter 5, part of the ritual is to take the oath and have it written out on the scroll. We'll talk about that more in a bit. And then it would be rubbed into the water so that the letters would be erased. Now, part of what was written on that was God's name, the Yud He Vav He. And erasing God's name, as you know, is a transgression. It is one that is, avoided at all costs. It's why we have genizas and why we bury books, because we do not erase God's name. We do not destroy God's name in any way. So what they're saying is, look, if you did something wrong, we're not going to blame you. You did it for whatever silly reason, drunk reason, bad neighbors, young and stupid reason. We get it. It's okay. But if you did it, just confess now and refuse to go through with the ritual so that we don't have to erase God's name for no reason. Make sense? Okay. And they say to her matters which neither she nor all her family or her father's house is worthy to hear, right? They go on and on and on as in this way to try and convince her that this is there, and in a sense, shame her, to say that, okay, you did it, this wasn't right, this is okay. And they would even explain that our ancestors have also done shameful things. Right? Famously, they'll talk about Judah and Tamar, right? That there are cases where people have done things that they should be ashamed of, and yet Judah, what did he do? He admitted it, right? He came forward and said, that she is more righteous than me. So our ancestors have done bad things. Lots of other people have done bad things and stupid things. If you've done a bad thing, done a stupid thing, it's not okay, but just confess now rather than making us go through with the ritual. All right, questions? You hear somebody's mic, but I'm not sure if that's a question or just things moving around. All right, so we'll continue with the rest of chapter 1 next week, same time, 7 o'clock. And if you're wondering how in the world are we going to get through one bit of chapter 5 and take 9 chapters to do it, it's because there are many digressions and other topics that are going to come up. We are not only going to be talking about this particular ritual. Mishnah Sotah has a number of other very important ethical and historical lessons to teach us. It is not only about the relations between husband and wife. So hold on, because we've got a lot of ground to cover before we finish all 9 chapters.
All right. Thanks, Rabbi.
Rabbi.
All right, everyone, take care, be well, stay safe.
Thanks for listening.
Yeah.